Injured horse was left to die in storm. But when this man found her, everyone cried. The rain came down in sheets, turning the countryside into a treacherous maze of mud and flowing water. Elliot Mason pulled his collar higher against the wind as he secured the last of his farm animals in the barn. At 58, his joints protested against the damp weather, but years of farming had taught him to never leave a task unfinished. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A desperate, pain-filled whinny carried through the wind. "Martha!" he called to his wife through the barn door. "Bring me the flashlight and my emergency kit." Martha appeared moments later, concern etched on her weathered face. "Elliot, you can't go out in this. The creek's rising." "Something's hurt out there," he replied, already checking the batteries in the flashlight. "I can't leave it." Following the sound led him to the creek's edge, where the beam of his flashlight revealed a sight that made his heart stop. A horse, magnificent despite its current state, lay half-submerged in the rising water. Its coat, which might have once been chestnut, was matted with blood and mud. A deep gash ran along its flank, and one leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "Dear Lord," Elliot breathed, approaching slowly. The horse's eyes, wild with pain and fear, locked onto him. It tried to rise but collapsed with a cry that cut through the storm's fury. Elliot knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, to make a decision. The creek was rising fast, and the horse would drown if left here. But moving an injured animal this size in these conditions could be fatal for both of them. "Easy there," he murmured, inching closer. "I'm not going to hurt you." The horse's ears flicked toward his voice, and something in its gaze shifted. Later, Elliot would swear this was the moment that changed everything. When fear met compassion, and trust began its fragile journey. Within moments, he was knee-deep in the freezing water, running his hands gently over the horse's body to assess the damage. Female, he noted, probably around 6 years old. The injuries were severe but not immediately fatal. The real danger was exposure and blood loss. "Martha!" he shouted over his shoulder. "Call Doc Stevens, and get Tom from next door. We're going to need help." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Tom arrived with his sons and their tractor. Doc Stevens, the local veterinarian, made it through the storm with his emergency supplies. Together, they worked to stabilize the horse and carefully move her to Elliot's barn. "She's been shot," Doc Stevens announced grimly, examining the wound by lantern light. "Looks like a hunting accident, maybe. The bullet's still in there." "Can you save her?" Elliot asked, already knowing he wouldn't accept any other answer. The vet met his gaze steadily. "I can try. But Elliot, even if she survives the night, she'll need weeks of intensive care. The leg injury alone. She might never walk properly again." "Then we'll take it one day at a time," Elliot replied, watching as the horse's chest rose and fell with labored breaths. In the warm light of the barn, he could see embers of red in her matted coat, glowing like dying fire. "Ember," he whispered, touching her neck gently. "We'll call you Ember." Martha appeared with blankets and hot coffee for everyone. "The storm's getting worse," she reported. "Doc, you'd better stay the night." As the others moved to the house, Elliot stayed behind, settling onto a bale of hay near Ember. He knew the next few hours would be critical. The horse's eyes, though glazed with pain, followed his movements. "You're safe now," he told her softly. "Whatever happened to you, whatever brought you here, it's over. You just focus on staying with us." Outside, the storm raged on, but in the barn, a different kind of weather was brewing, one of hope, determination, and the beginning of an extraordinary bond between a man and a horse who both refused to give up. Dawn broke with a gentleness that belied the previous night's violence. Elliot, who hadn't slept a wink, watched as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the barn's windows, casting a golden glow on Ember's still form. She had made it through the night, barely. Doc Stevens returned from his brief rest, looking as weary as Elliot felt. "We need to operate now," he said, unpacking his medical supplies. That bullet has to come out, and those wounds need proper cleaning. The next few hours were a testament to both modern veterinary medicine and sheer determination. Martha kept bringing fresh hot water and clean towels, while Tom's boys helped hold Ember steady during the most critical moments. "There's something else," Doc Stevens said quietly as he worked. "See these old scars? And the way her muscles have developed? This horse was trained for racing, but something went wrong. These aren't just accident marks. Someone's been mistreating her." Elliot's jaw tightened. In their small farming community of Millbrook Valley, stories of abused horses weren't common, but they existed. Usually, it involved unscrupulous trainers pushing animals too hard, too fast, for quick profit. "The bullet wound is recent," the vet continued, "but these other injuries, I'd say she's been through hell for at least a year." As if understanding they were discussing her past, Ember let out a soft whimper. Elliot moved to her head, stroking her neck gently. "That's all behind you now, girl," he murmured. "I promise." By midday, the operation was complete. The bullet had been removed, wounds cleaned and stitched, and the broken leg set as best as possible. Doc Stevens stood back, wiping his brow. "I've done what I can," he said. "The rest is up to her. And you, Elliot. She'll need round-the-clock care for at least 2 weeks. After that, if she survives, we're looking at months of rehabilitation." Martha appeared with sandwiches and coffee. "We'll manage," she said firmly, giving her husband a supportive smile. "We always do." As word spread through the village about the injured horse, opinions were divided. Some, like Tom and his family, offered help and support. Others were less encouraging. "You're wasting your time and money," Mason, Frank Whitaker, the local livestock dealer, declared when he stopped by that afternoon. "A horse that badly injured? You should put her down and save yourself the trouble." Elliot just shook his head. "You didn't see her eyes last night, Frank. There's fight in her." The first week was the hardest. Ember couldn't stand, which meant they had to turn her every few hours to prevent sores. Elliot slept in the barn, setting an alarm to wake him for medication times and position changes. Martha worried about her husband's health, but she understood. In their 35 years of marriage, she'd seen this side of him before, the quiet determination that came when he believed in something deeply. "Remember that 3-legged calf everyone said wouldn't make it?" She reminded him one evening, bringing his dinner to the barn. "He lived to be 12 years old. You gave him a chance when no one else would." Elliot smiled, accepting the warm plate. "This is different, Martha. Ember. There's something special about her. I can feel it." As if in response to his words, Ember lifted her head weakly and nickered softly. It was the first voluntary sound she'd made since the surgery, and it brought tears to Martha's eyes. "Well," she said, wiping her cheeks, "looks like we've got ourselves another family member." The second week brought small victories. Ember began eating more regularly, her eyes grew clearer, and the wounds started showing signs of proper healing. Doc Stevens visited every other day, each time looking more optimistic. "I've seen a lot of horses give up with less severe injuries," he admitted during one checkup. "But she's fighting, and having you here constantly, Elliot, that makes a difference. Horses are sensitive to energy and intention. She knows you're on her side." Word of Ember's progress spread through the village, and gradually, more supporters emerged. School children started visiting after classes, reading stories aloud in the barn because someone had told them horses liked voices. Local farmers dropped off extra hay or medicine, refusing payment. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating, providing clear, warm days that allowed them to leave the barn doors open, letting fresh air and sunlight stream in. Ember would watch the world outside with increasing interest, her ears perking up at new sounds. One morning, during their daily routine, Elliot noticed something different in Ember's eyes, a spark he hadn't seen before. She was tracking his movements more alertly, responding to his voice with subtle ear movements. "You're coming back to us, aren't you?" he said softly, running a brush gently over her coat. The matted, Muddy fur was gradually giving way to a rich chestnut color that truly justified her name. Martha found him there an hour later, still brushing and talking quietly to the horse. She smiled, remembering why she'd fallen in love with this man so many years ago. His capacity for gentleness, his unwavering patience, these were rare qualities in their fast-paced world. "Lunch is ready," she announced, and Sarah from the feed store called. "She's found some special supplements that might help with the healing process." Elliot nodded, giving Ember a final pat. "We're getting there," he said, more to the horse than to his wife. "One day at a time, we're getting there." 3 weeks after the storm, early morning sunlight streamed through the barn windows, casting long shadows across the straw-covered floor. Elliot was doing his usual morning check when he noticed Ember's muscles trembling in a way he hadn't seen before. "Easy girl," he said, moving closer. But instead of distress, he saw determination in her eyes. Ember was trying to stand. "Martha," he called out, not taking his eyes off the horse. "Martha, come quick." His wife appeared at the barn door just as Ember made her first real attempt. The horse's muscles strained, her good legs scrambling for purchase in the straw. For a moment, it seemed impossible. Then, with a tremendous effort, she pushed herself up. She swayed dangerously, the injured leg barely touching the ground, but she was standing. Elliot moved closer, ready to support her if needed, his heart pounding with equal parts excitement and concern. "That's it, girl," he encouraged softly. "You've got this." Ember stood for nearly a minute before her strength gave out, and she carefully lowered herself back down. But that minute changed everything. Proved what Elliot had believed all along: Ember wasn't ready to give up. Doc Stevens arrived later that morning for his scheduled checkup and was amazed at the news. "This changes our timeline," he said, examining Ember's leg carefully. "We can start thinking about proper rehabilitation now." "But Elliot," he added seriously, "this is where it gets complicated. Getting her to stand is one thing. Teaching her to walk properly again, that's another challenge entirely." As if fate was listening, later that afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. Old Joe McCarty, a retired horse trainer known throughout the county for his gentle methods, pulled up in his weathered pickup truck. "Heard about your miracle horse," he said by way of greeting. "Thought I might be able to help." Joe had spent 50 years training horses, specializing in rehabilitating injured ones. His methods were considered unusual by some. He believed in letting the horse set the pace, using patience and understanding rather than force. "The key," he explained to Elliot as they watched Ember, "is to remember that healing isn't just physical. She's carrying emotional scars too. Every step forward needs to build her confidence as much as her strength." Over the next few days, Joe became a regular visitor, teaching Elliot techniques for supporting Ember's weight, exercises to prevent muscle atrophy, and most importantly, how to read her signals. "See how her ears flicked just then?" he'd say. "She's telling us she's ready for more. But watch her eyes. They'll tell you when it's too much." The rehabilitation process was slow and demanding. They started with simple standing exercises, gradually increasing the duration. Ember would often lean against Elliot for support, and this physical dependency created an even deeper bond between them. Martha noticed the change in her husband too. Despite the exhausting work, he seemed energized, purposeful. She'd catch him reading veterinary books late into the night, making notes about rehabilitation techniques and horse psychology. The village's interest in Ember's recovery grew. Children would stop by after school, bringing carrots and apples. Their innocent enthusiasm seemed to lift Ember's spirits, and she began to show more of her personality. Gentle, intelligent, and surprisingly playful despite her injuries. One morning, about a month after her first standing attempt, Ember did something that brought tears to everyone's eyes. As Elliot entered the barn with her breakfast, she nickered a greeting and took 3 shaky steps toward him. "Would you look at that?" Joe whispered, standing in the doorway. "She's not just walking to walk. She's walking to get to you, Elliot." Those first steps marked the beginning of a new phase. Each day brought small improvements. More confident movements, better balance, increased strength. The injured leg would never be perfect, but Ember was adapting, learning to compensate. Word of her progress spread beyond their small community. A reporter from the county newspaper came to write a story, touching on not just Ember's physical recovery, but the way her journey had brought the community together. "It's more than just a horse getting better," Martha told the reporter. "It's about hope, about not giving up when things seem impossible." The article caught the attention of a group that rehabilitated former racehorses. They offered to provide specialized equipment and additional medical support. Their expert evaluation confirmed what they'd begun to suspect: Ember had indeed been a racehorse, likely abandoned or discarded after her initial injuries made her unprofitable. "Some people see horses as investments," Joe said grimly when he heard this. "But they're living beings with hearts and spirits. What you're doing here, Elliot, you're not just saving her body, you're healing her soul." As summer approached, Ember's progress continued to amaze everyone. She could now walk the length of the barn several times a day, and though she had a noticeable limp, her movement was steady and determined. But it was during one quiet evening that Elliot witnessed something that truly showed how far they'd come. He was sitting on a hay bale, reading, when Ember slowly made her way over and deliberately rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture of complete trust and affection. "You know," he said softly, stroking her neck, "everyone thinks I saved you, but the truth is, you've given me just as much as I've given you." As autumn painted the countryside in rich golds and reds, Ember's recovery had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. She could now spend hours in the small paddock Elliot had specially modified for her rehabilitation, and her coat gleamed with health in the crisp sunlight. However, their peaceful progress was interrupted one morning when a sleek black car pulled up to the farm. A well-dressed man stepped out, introducing himself as James Harrison, representing Golden Gate Stables. "Mr. Mason," he said, pulling out some papers, "I believe you have our horse." Elliot felt his heart skip a beat. Martha, who had come to stand beside him, gripped his arm tightly. "According to our records," Harrison continued, "this mare was sold to us 2 years ago. She was reported stolen 6 months later. We've been tracking her since that article appeared in the county paper. The documentation seemed legitimate: registration papers, sale contracts, and even photographs of a younger Ember at what appeared to be Golden Gate Stables. But something didn't add up. If she was so valuable to you," Elliot said carefully, "why wasn't there a wider search when she disappeared? And how did she end up shot and half dead in our creek?" Harrison's professional smile faltered slightly. "Those are unfortunate circumstances we're still investigating. However, the legal ownership is clear. We're prepared to compensate you for your expenses in rehabilitating her." Old Joe, who happened to be there that morning, had been quietly observing. Now he stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "Golden Gate Stables," he mused aloud. "Wasn't that the outfit investigated last year for insurance fraud? Something about claiming horses were stolen after they'd been injured." Harrison's face reddened. "Those allegations were never proven." "Maybe not," Joe continued, "but I remember some other stories too, about horses disappearing after they stopped winning." The tension in the yard was palpable. Ember, watching from her paddock, seemed to sense it. She nickered softly, and Elliot noticed she was pressing herself against the far corner, as far from Harrison as possible. "I'll tell you what," Elliot said finally, "I'm going to have my lawyer look over these papers. And I'm sure the sheriff would be interested in investigating how one of your horses ended up shot and abandoned." Harrison's facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Mason, be reasonable. This could become very expensive for you very quickly." That's when Martha stepped forward, her usually gentle face fierce with protective anger. "Is that a threat, Mr. Harrison? Because I'm sure the local media would love to hear about how a big stable treats their horses, and how they threaten small farmers who save them." The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. When word spread about Harrison's visit, people began showing up at the farm. Tom and his sons came first, then other neighbors, local farmers, and even the children who regularly visited Ember. They formed a quiet but determined presence. Sheriff Davies arrived as well, having heard about the situation. "Interesting timing," he commented, reviewing the papers. "Coming to claim her only after she's healthy again. I think we need to look into this more deeply." Harrison left that afternoon, promising to return with his lawyers, but something in his manner suggested he knew he'd lost this battle. The investigation that followed revealed the ugly truth. Golden Gate Stables had indeed been running an insurance scam, disposing of injured horses and claiming they were stolen. Ember had been one of their victims, shot and abandoned when her initial injuries made her unsuitable for racing. The evidence led to multiple arrests and the closure of Golden Gate Stables. More importantly, it led to changes in local laws regarding horse welfare and ownership. "You see," Joe told Elliot one evening as they watched Ember grazing peacefully, "sometimes it takes one story to open people's eyes. Ember's journey has done more than just heal her. It's helping protect other horses too." The legal battle officially ended 3 months later when Elliot received the court documents confirming his ownership of Ember. But he knew the truth: Ember had chosen her own home the night she fought to survive in that storm. To celebrate, the community organized a small festival at the farm. Children decorated Ember's paddock with ribbons and flowers. Local farmers brought hay and treats. The county paper sent their photographer to capture the moment when Ember, wearing a bright new halter, proudly walked around her paddock, showing off how far she'd come. "You know what the best part is?" Martha said to Elliot as they watched the celebration. "She's smiling. I didn't know horses could smile until I met her." Indeed, Ember seemed to be glowing with happiness, graciously accepting treats from the children and gently nuzzling the hands that reached out to pet her. Her eyes, once wild with fear and pain, now sparkled with contentment and trust. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Elliot sat in his usual spot in the barn. Ember came to stand beside him, her injured leg still bearing its scars but strong enough now to support her weight. "We did it, girl," he whispered, running his hand along her neck. "We showed them all what's possible when you don't give up." Winter settled over Millbrook Valley, bringing with it crisp mornings and peaceful snowfalls. But inside Elliot's heated barn, something remarkable was taking shape. The publicity surrounding Ember's case had attracted unexpected attention, and not just from the media. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinary rehabilitation specialist from the State University, arrived one snowy morning. She had read about Ember's recovery and saw an opportunity. "Mr. Mason," she said, watching Ember move around her paddock with gentle determination, "what you've accomplished here is extraordinary. Would you consider turning this into something bigger?" Her proposal was both exciting and daunting. The university wanted to establish a satellite rehabilitation center for injured horses, using Elliot's farm as the location. They would provide funding, expertise, and support, while maintaining the gentle, personal approach that had worked so well with Ember. "It's not just about physical rehabilitation," Dr. Mitchell explained. "Your methods, the community involvement, the emotional healing, that's what makes this special. We could help so many horses." Martha found Elliot in the barn that evening, deep in thought. "You're considering it, aren't you?" she asked softly. "I keep thinking about that night in the storm," he replied, watching Ember doze in her stall. What if no one had heard her? How many other horses out there need someone to hear them? The decision wasn't made lightly. It would mean significant changes to their quiet farm life. But when they presented the idea to the community at the town hall meeting, the support was overwhelming. "My boys could help with the construction," Tom offered immediately. "And we've got that spare pasture connecting to your land. You could use it for recovering horses." Sarah from the feed store stood up next. "I can coordinate with suppliers for special dietary needs. And my daughter's studying veterinary medicine. She'd love to intern here." Even Frank Whitaker, who had initially doubted Ember's chances, spoke up. "My grandfather left me those old stables by the creek. They need work, but they're yours if you want them." The project, which they named Ember's Hope, began to take shape as winter turned to spring. The university provided architects who specialized in therapeutic facilities for horses. Local contractors donated time and materials. The community organized fundraisers, and soon the quiet farm was transforming into something extraordinary. Through it all, Ember remained the heart of the operation. She seemed to understand her role as the inspiration behind it all, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that touched everyone who met her. But it was her interaction with the first new arrival that truly showed her special nature. A young stallion, badly injured in a transport accident, arrived one rainy evening. He was terrified, aggressive, and resistant to human contact, much like Ember had been that first night. To everyone's amazement, Ember appeared at the fence of her paddock, nickering softly to the newcomer. Over the next few days, her calm presence seemed to soothe him. She would stand for hours by the fence, just being there, showing him that healing was possible. She remembers, Joe observed, watching this interaction. She knows what it's like to be where he is, and she's showing him the way out. As spring progressed, more horses arrived. Each came with its own story of trauma or neglect, and each responded to the unique combination of professional care and community love that had saved Ember. The university students who came to study and help were amazed by what they saw. "It's not just a rehabilitation center," one wrote in her thesis. "It's a place where hope is restored, not just for the horses, but for everyone involved." Children from the local schools started coming for educational programs, learning about horse care and the importance of compassion. Veterans groups discovered the therapeutic value of working with the recovering horses. The project was healing more than just injured animals. It was healing people too. 1 year to the day after finding Ember in the storm, Elliot stood in the center of what had become a thriving sanctuary. The original barn had been expanded into a state-of-the-art facility, but it still maintained its warm, welcoming atmosphere. Paddocks full of recovering horses stretched across the rolling hills, each animal with its own story of survival. Ember, now fully recovered except for a slight limp that only seemed to add to her character, stood beside him. Her role had evolved from patient to teacher, showing both horses and humans the power of resilience and trust. "You know what, girl?" Elliot said, scratching her favorite spot behind her ears. "Sometimes the biggest miracles start with the smallest acts of kindness." As if in agreement, Ember pressed her head against his shoulder, her eyes bright with the same fighting spirit that had caught his attention that stormy night. Around them, the sanctuary buzzed with activity, veterinarians making their rounds, volunteers tending to the horses, children learning about animal care, and always the sound of healing. 5 years had passed since that fateful stormy night, and Ember's hope had become more than anyone could have imagined. The sanctuary now sprawled across 50 acres, with specialized rehabilitation facilities, a small veterinary hospital, and educational centers. But despite its growth, it never lost the personal touch that made it special. On a warm summer morning, Elliot sat in his favorite spot, a small bench under an old oak tree overlooking the main paddocks. At 27, Ember was now considered a senior horse, her muzzle graying gracefully, but her eyes still sparkled with that same determined spirit. "Mr. Mason," called a young voice. 10-year-old Lucy, who had been coming to the sanctuary since she was in kindergarten, came running up the path. "Can you tell us the story again? About how you found Ember?" Behind her was a group of new volunteers, eager to hear the tale that had become almost legendary in their community. Ember, hearing Lucy's voice, lifted her head and ambled over to the fence. "Well," Elliot began, as Ember nuzzled Lucy's outstretched hand. It was the kind of night when most folks would stay inside. As he told the story, Elliot watched the faces of his listeners. They weren't just hearing about a horse's rescue. They were learning about hope, determination, and the power of community. Over the years, Ember's hope had helped rehabilitate more than 200 horses, but its impact went far beyond numbers. There was Jimmy, a troubled teenager who found purpose helping with the rehabilitation programs. Now he was studying to become a veterinarian. And Maria, a veteran struggling with PTSD, who discovered healing through working with the horses. She now ran the sanctuary's therapeutic riding program. The sanctuary had also become a model for other facilities across the country. Researchers came to study their methods, combining traditional veterinary medicine with the emotional support that made their success rate so high. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was the change in how the local community viewed animal welfare. The county now had some of the strongest horse protection laws in the state, and local stables had adopted higher standards of care. The thing about Ember, Elliot continued his story, is that she didn't just survive, she showed us all how to be better humans. As if on cue, Ember lifted her head and nickered softly. In the paddock next to hers, a recently rescued mare responded. This was what made Ember special, her ability to communicate with both horses and humans, bridging the gap between species with her gentle wisdom. Martha appeared with a tray of lemonade for the volunteers. Her hair had grayed along with Ember's, but her eyes still held the same kindness that had helped support their mission from the beginning. "You know," she said, joining Elliot on the bench, "when you stayed up all those nights with her, I never imagined we'd end up here." "None of us did," Elliot replied, watching as Lucy carefully offered Ember an apple. "But sometimes the best dreams are the ones we never knew we had." The sanctuary had become more than a place of healing. It was a living testament to what could happen when compassion met determination. Every horse that recovered and found a new home, every person who discovered hope within its fences, added another chapter to Ember's story. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the paddocks, Elliot did his usual evening rounds. Each horse had their own story of survival, their own journey of healing. But they all shared one thing in common. They were given a second chance, just like Ember. In her paddock, Ember stood quietly, watching over her domain. She might have started as a broken racehorse, but she had become something far more valuable: a teacher, a healer, and a symbol of resilience. "You know what, old girl?" Elliot said softly, pausing at her gate. "You didn't just survive that storm. You showed us all how to weather our own." Ember pressed her nose against his hand, her gentle breath warm in the evening air. Around them, the sanctuary settled into its peaceful nighttime routine. Horses nickering softly, volunteers finishing their tasks, and the distant sound of children's laughter fading into the dusk. This was Ember's true legacy. Not just the buildings or programs that bore her name, but the countless lives, both human and equine, that had been touched by her story. She had shown that sometimes the most broken among us can become the strongest, and that healing is possible when hearts and hands work together. As darkness fell, the lights of Ember's hope glowed warmly across the valley, a beacon of hope for all who needed it. And in her comfortable stall, Ember settled in for the night, surrounded by the love she had helped create, her spirit living on in every life she had touched.